Hello everyone, Loremaster Sotek here with some speculation. So this is not a video looking at anything that has been officially announced or released. I'm just kind of throwing some darts at a wall and seeing if I hit anything interesting. A lot of us have already been informed that Creative Assembly is introducing a new lore into the game alongside the Curse of the Vampire Coast, which is the lore of the deeps. Now, we don't know a lot about this lore, other than obviously it's going to have a very ocean theme to it. But I thought I would look at some sources that might have provided inspiration to what kind of spells we're going to see in this lore. So the things I'm going to be looking at today are I'm going to be looking at 3 iterations of the lore of Manon, which is a divine lore from the Warhammer Fantasy roleplay game. Which you may think, okay, why is the roleplay game even coming up? There hasn't been any roleplay direct correlations, and that's not quite true. There have been some things we've seen in the roleplay, because the roleplay, of course, borrowed from other sources, like the Prometheans from the Curse of the Vampire Coast are more likely from the Man of War game, but they also showed up prominently in the Warhammer Fantasy roleplay game 2nd edition as a monster you could fight out at sea and stuff like that. So I thought we would just kind of go through these, and I'm not going to go over every single prayer from the lores of Manon, because a lot of them just can't work in a battle setting, because they do stuff like, you know, calm the winds in the sea, or give you favorable winds so that your ship moves faster. But some of them could actually make for some interesting spells, and I thought I'd just take a look at them just for the sake of having something to talk about today, and, you know, just fun speculation. So right here, I've got the Warhammer Fantasy Roleplay 4th edition, which we're going to be running a campaign here on the channel pretty soon when the physical copies arrive, just because I don't want to run a campaign out of a PDF, because that's a nightmare. So yeah, we'll talk more about that when we're closer. But in any event, there's 2 that I wanted to look at here. The first is a prayer called Sea Legs, which when cast on someone says, your targets are immediately drenched in seawater and reel as if on the rolling deck of a tempest-tossed vessel. Their hair is whipped by spectral winds, and a torrent of spray lashes their skin. They gain they become blind, deaf, and fatigued. And if they fail a move action, or if they attempt to move and fail an agility test, they also go prone. So this Sea Legs, it's kind of a weird name for what the spell does, but it would be kind of interesting if it was like a debuff that would reduce a unit's, say, melee attack and melee defense as you cast it on them, and it basically just tossed them all about, like, you know, you're preparing a salad for dinner and you're shaking it up, and could make for an interesting debuff spell to essentially just make units fighting skill drastically decrease. Once again, I'm not saying any of these are actually going to be the game. I'm just having fun with this speculation, and I needed something to talk about today, so there we go. The other one that I thought would be kind of fun is Water Walk, which the Water Walk miracle from 4th edition makes it so that you can cross large bodies of water by just walking on the sea. Now, this one I think would actually be really cool if there was one thing I would like to see would be buffs or spells that interact with the terrain that we see in Total War Warhammer. That's not something we've really seen yet, but if, like, you're playing on a map that has aquatic terrain and you were able to cast a buff on a unit that gave them the aquatic trait for a time, I actually think that would be a really cool buff, especially on infantry, you know, as it would cause them to speed up a lot. And as we've seen with the Skinks and Kroxigors, it also increases your melee attack and melee defense by like 20%, I think, which could be a pretty substantial buff depending on the army. That's all we got from 4th edition, so let's go back to 2nd edition. So this is from the Tome of Salvation, which was an expansion to 2nd edition, and it has pretty much the same spells, but it's got a couple of other little interesting ones. For instance, Drowned Man's Face, which is pretty much you cast this spell on an enemy and it causes their lungs to fill with seawater until they're able to cough it out. One thing I think would be cool for this is if it was an ability or spell. Drowned Man's Face would be excellent as, like, forcing an ability recharge on, like, a wizard, for instance, because obviously if they can't talk, they can't cast. That's a fundamental rule of Magic and Warhammer. Or, you know, if it's general, you know, they can't maybe use some of their abilities like stand your ground and such if they are choking to death because their lungs are full of water. So maybe this could be like a spell or an ability that you just cast it on someone and it adds 15 to 30 seconds to their ability recharge. Another one that is pretty interesting is the Curse of the Albatross, which the albatross is a sacred symbol to Manon. It's kind of like his bird. And the Curse of the Albatross essentially just makes it so you are much more vulnerable to critical hits. This could be fun by, if it was a spell that lowered your armor and defense, for instance. It just dropped your armor by like 15 to 30 and your melee defense maybe by like 5 or 10. That could be a really fun ability there. Of course, this one had sea legs as well. Another one that I thought looked pretty interesting is just Water Blast, which they hopefully would make the name more exciting. But Water Blast is literally just a magic missile. You just shoot out a whole bunch of water at somebody and it causes a bunch of damage. So this would just kind of be like a water-themed version of maybe Shim's Burning Gaze or Fireball or something like that. Pretty straightforward, but most lores can use just a straight damage dealing ability that's really nice and lets you hurt somebody pretty bad. And that's pretty much all the interesting ones from this one. Now let's go to this one I actually have a physical copy of, but just looking at it, none of these are actually interesting. So now let's go to the one a lot of people have been pointing to, which this is the Lore of the Deeps. But this is the Lore of the Deeps from Age of Sigmar. So the Idoneth Deepkin are a race that was fairly recently released in Age of Sigmar, and they are essentially sea elves. They are descendants of the elves from Warhammer Fantasy who live in the deep, dark places of the ocean to basically repress their senses so that they can hide from Slaanesh. And of course, they have a lore that's all about the ocean. So let's take a look at what they could do. This is probably the one a lot more people are interested in. So their first spell they have is called Steed of Tides, which the description is that the wizard conjures a watery elemental to transport themselves or a comrade swiftly across the battlefield. And functionally, essentially what it does is it allows you to take a character and teleport them to somewhere on the battlefield. Now, if this spell was translated into Total War Warhammer, I imagine all it would actually do is just give you like a really big speed buff, like maybe 25 to 50% speed. And maybe you could only cast it on like specific characters. For instance, we know that the Mourngul Haunter is a character now, or the Vampire Fleet Captain, so maybe you would cast it on them so that they would hustle across the field, or obviously if you have a lord on a big monstrous creature, that could be a good way to give you some hustle. Not a super crazy spell. It's kind of same in function to Skitter Leap, but the way they did Skitter Leap is that it gives you a speed buff and makes you invisible, because they didn't want to put an actual teleport mechanic into the game, understandably. So maybe Steed of Tides could work similar to that. The next one is Abyssal Darkness. The spellcaster spreads their arms wide and streamers of darkness pour from their outstretched fingers, surrounding themselves and nearby allies in shadow. And functionally what this spell does is it basically gives everybody a bonus as if they're in cover, so it provides them a defense bonus against enemy attacks. So one way this could work is if you had an Abyssal Darkness spell, it would be like an AoE like 40 to 30 meter 30 to 40 meter range spell that you would cast, and it would make all of the units have like much higher physical or missile resistance, which could actually be really cool for a slow army of zombies, especially if you're like trading missile fire. If you were able to just give like AoE 22 or 33% missile resistance, that would be pretty powerful. The next one is Vorpal Maelstrom. An etheric whirlpool manifests in the heart of an enemy formation, snatching up warriors and smashing them against each other. So this one, functionally what it does is you basically just pick a unit, or you pick a point on the battlefield, and all the units around it are basically sucked into a vortex and just take a lot of damage. And this I could just see being a straightforward vortex spell, kind of like Hit of Shades, or maybe not necessarily, kind of like Flamestorm, where you cast it and it, or maybe Purple Sun would be the best example. You cast it and it basically sucks people into the center of it and just jostles them around and does a bunch of damage. That could be fun, especially if it was like a wider template and maybe didn't do as much damage, but was more about just ripping everybody into each other and throwing them around. It takes units, models a while to stand up and get back into formation, and it often causes a pretty serious speed debuff to the unit when they have models dragging behind. So that could actually be a pretty powerful spell, even if it wasn't like a ton of damage. The next spell is Pressure of the Deep, which is the wizard enfolds their victim in a shimmering bubble of crushing force. So essentially, this spell is that you surround an enemy model in a bubble, and if they don't survive it, they just die instantly. And it's designed to focus a single model. So what I would recommend if they were copying this lore, which I don't think they are, but if they were, for Pressure of the Deep, I would have it basically be Spirit Leech, or Arcane Unforging, where you basically cast it on a single model. Like, you could cast it on a unit, but it would specialize against characters or single models, and it would just do a bunch of direct damage. That would probably be the most interesting way to handle that. The next spell is Tide of Fear, which is the spellcaster sends forth an invisible current that strikes fear into their foes. And this one literally just lowers the enemy bravery, and also makes it also debuffs their combat abilities a little bit. So for this, I would recommend, like, if there was a single target debuff, and what you would do is you'd cast it on an enemy unit, and it would lower their leadership and their melee attack by just a bit. I wouldn't have it do a ton, or else it would be a very, very expensive spell. But if it reduced like their melee attack by like 10 and their leadership by say 5, that could still be pretty devastating without being too over the top. And the final spell from the basic 6 of this lore is Arcane Corrasion, which is the spellcaster pushes forth a wave of etheric energy that picks up rubble from the ground and hurls it at the foe. And this is the strongest spell in this lore. Basically, they just send forth a tidal wave, and it just picks up debris, and the further the spell travels, the more damage it does. Now, this would be like a wind spell, similar to Wind of Death or Flaming Skull, Burning Skull. And I actually think this would be a super cool spell, where if CA, I don't even know if this would be possible in the engine, but imagine if there was a wind spell that when you cast it, at first it barely does any damage, but the closer it gets to its maximum limit, the more damage it does. So essentially, you would just draw a big line, and it would go down the line, and then the longer it's active, just the more damage it does. That could be a really interesting spell, and I kind of like that idea because it would reward you for angling it and timing it properly to make sure the end of the spell hits the biggest portion of your enemy, but it would also give your enemy the most time to avoid it, because obviously they would see the template go down for when the spell's about to be cast, and they would have all of your casting time as it's just sitting there charging up to get out of the way, and while the spell is moving, they also had time to get out of the way or try and lure your units into it so that you take the damage instead. So it would allow for some really interesting counterplay. So Arcane Corrasion would be a really interesting spell. Now, Age of Sigmar, there's a lot more spells than there were in Fantasy for the most part, just because a lot of lores have like individual caveat spells that only certain wizards can take, and we're going to go ahead and look at some of those. So the next one that only the Nautilor Tidecasters can take is a spell called Protective Barrier from their lore, which is Nautilor Tidecasters are adept at creating arcane barriers to protect their comrades from harm. Literally, it's just a barrier that lowers the armor piercing on enemy units. So this could be kind of fun if it was just a really cheap spell that you could throw on an ally and it just increased their armor and melee defense, very similar to Faw's Protection from the Lore of Light. And the final one is Freezing Mist, which is Morphon Tidecasters can summon freezing ethereal mists that slow the movement of their foes. And this one basically just makes a unit really, really slow in both how they fight in combat and how they move in certain situations. And I would imagine this would be very similar to Melkoth's Mystifying Miasma, where you would just throw it on a unit and it would do maybe a moderate amount, like just a tiny amount of damage, but seriously lower their speed. That way you could get some interesting counterplay. And that pretty much does it for inspirations. There's just the Lore of Manan, which has only been through some minor updates over time, and then the Lore of the Deeps. Now, you can tell that this Lore of the Deeps, you can't just copy paste this for the Vampire Coast, because the Vampire Coast has a very different functionality than the Idoneth Deepkin do. The Idoneth Deepkin are much faster because they're an elven-based faction with a lot of like swimming monsters that swim through the air, literally. And the zombies of the Vampire Coast are obviously zombies, so they're going to be much slower. And they're obviously a primarily ground-based faction, not floating sea monsters. So I would say that, while some of these all of these spells could theoretically be translated to be interesting, I imagine the lore is for the most part going to be entirely brand new, just because the Zombie Coast is a very different faction from the Night in the Deepkin. So this is probably nothing, but I just thought it'd be a fun thing to share. And I've seen a lot of people be like, Lore of the Deeps, but Games Workshop has Lore of the Deeps. But I don't think they're going to be actually related. However, I would love to hear your thoughts. So if you think, tell me in the comment section below which of these spells that I've gone over, or prayers from the Lore of Manon, do you think would be the most likely to make it in, if they did, and would be the most fun? And which do you think would be the least likely to make it in and just would not work with the faction at all? I'd love to hear your thoughts on it. In any event, I hope you're all having a great day. And of course, tomorrow is Monday, so we've got another week of big reveals. And I cannot wait to see what else Creative Assembly has to show us. Not Games Workshop, Creative Assembly. So thank you all for watching, and I will see you, without a doubt, tomorrow. Bye.